Edward de Vere, better known as William Shakespeare, 1550 to 1604. The great British playwright and poet William Shakespeare is generally acknowledged to be the greatest writer who ever lived. There is a good deal of dispute about his identity, which will be discussed below, but the talent and achievements of the author are agreed to by all. Shakespeare wrote at least 36 plays, including such masterpieces as Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Julius Caesar, and Othello, a magnificent set of 154 sonnets, and a few longer poems. In view of his genius, accomplishments, and deserved fame, it may seem a bit odd that his name does not appear higher on this list. I have ranked Shakespeare this low not because I am unappreciative of his artistic accomplishments, but only because of my belief that in general, literary and artistic figures have had comparatively little influence on human history. The activities of a religious leader, scientist, politician, explorer, or philosopher frequently influence developments in many other fields of human endeavor. For example, scientific advances have had tremendous impact upon economic and political affairs and have also affected religious beliefs, philosophical attitudes, and developments in art. However, a famous painter, though he may have a great deal of influence upon the work of subsequent painters, is likely to have very little influence upon the development of music and literature, and virtually none upon science, exploration, or other fields of human endeavor. Similar statements can be made concerning poets, playwrights, and composers of music. In general, artistic figures influence only art, and indeed only the particular field of art in which they work. It is for this reason that no figure in the literary, musical, or visual arts has been ranked in the top 20, and only a handful appear on this list at all. Why then are there any artistic figures on this list? One answer is that our general culture, is, in the sociological sense, is in part created by art. Art helps to form the connective glue of society. It is no accident that art is a feature of every human civilization that has ever existed. Furthermore, the enjoyment of art plays a direct part in the life of each individual person. In other words, an individual may spend most of his time reading books, part of his time looking at paintings, etc. Even if the time we spend listening to music had no effect whatsoever upon our other activities, that time would still represent some not insignificant fraction of our lives. However, art does affect our other activities, and in some sense, our whole life. Art connects us to our souls. It expresses our deepest feelings and validates them for us. In some cases, artistic works have a more or less explicit philosophical content, which can influence our attitudes on other topics. This, of course, occurs more frequently in the case of literary compositions than in the case of music or paintings. For example, when in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare has the prince say, "Mercy but murders, pardoning those that kill." An idea is presented that has obvious philosophical content and is more likely to influence political attitudes than is, say, viewing the Mona Lisa. It seems beyond dispute that Shakespeare is preeminent among all literary figures. Relatively few people today read the works of Chaucer, Virgil, or even Homer, except when those works are assigned reading in school. However, a performance of one of the Shakespeare's play is certain to be well attended. Shakespeare's gift for a well turned phrase is without parallel, and he is frequently quoted even by persons who have never seen or read his plays. Furthermore, it is plain that his popularity is not a mere passing fad. His works have given pleasure to readers and viewers for almost 4 centuries. As they have already stood the test of time, it seems reasonable to assume that the works of Shakespeare will continue to be popular for a good many centuries to come. In assessing Shakespeare's importance, one should take into account that had he not lived, his plays would never have been written at all. Although Shakespeare wrote in English, he is truly a world figure. If not quite a universal language, English is closer to being one than any other language ever has been. Moreover, Shakespeare's works have been very widely translated, and his works have been read and performed in a very large number of countries. There are, of course, some popular authors whose writings are disdained by literary critics. Not so with Shakespeare, whose works have received unstinting praise from literary scholars. Generations of playwrights have studied his works and have attempted to emulate his literary virtues. This combination of enormous influence on other writers and continued worldwide popularity makes it plain that William Shakespeare is entitled to a high position in this book. However, there has long been a controversy as to the identity of the man who wrote under that name. The orthodox view, which I accepted uncritically when writing the first edition of this book, is that he was the same person as William Shakespeare, who was born in Stratford on Avon in 1564 and died there in 1616. However, on carefully evaluating the arguments of the skeptics and the counter arguments of the orthodox, I have concluded that the skeptics have much the better of the argument and have reasonably established their case. The bulk of the evidence indicates that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and that William Shakespeare, the family name was spelled several ways in Stratford, but almost always with the first E. It was therefore pronounced quite differently with a short A. Then Shakespeare was merely a prosperous merchant whose business took him to London, but who had nothing to do with the writing of the plays. I am not suggesting that De Vere was a ghostwriter for Shakespeare who took public credit for the plays at the time. During his lifetime, Shakespeare was not considered to be the author, nor did he ever claim to be. The notion that Shakespeare was the great playwright William Shakespeare did not arise until 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare died, when the first folio edition of Shakespeare plays appeared. The editors of that book included some prefatory material in which it was strongly hinted that the man from Stratford was the author. To understand why it is so unlikely that Shakespeare was the playwright, it is first necessary to present the orthodox version of his biography, which goes as follows. Shakespeare's father, John, had once been fairly prosperous, but he fell on hard times, and young William was reared in difficult financial circumstances. Nevertheless, he attended the Stratford Grammar School, where he studied Latin and classical literature. When William was 18, he made a young woman named Anne Hathaway pregnant. He duly married her, and she gave birth a few months later. 2.5 years later, she gave birth to twins. So William had a wife and 3 children to support before he was 21 years old. We have no knowledge of his activities or whereabouts for the next 6 years, but in the early 1590s, he was present in London as a member of an acting group. He was a successful actor, but soon branched out into writing plays and poetry. By 1598, he was already being hailed as the greatest of all English writers, living or dead. Shakespeare stayed in London for about 20 years, during which time he wrote at least 36 plays, 154 sonnets, and a few longer poems. Within a few years, he became prosperous, and in 1597 was able to purchase an expensive home in Stratford. His family remained behind in Stratford the whole time, but he continued to support them. Oddly, he never published any of the great plays he was writing, but unscrupulous printers, realizing their commercial value, published pirated editions of nearly half of them. Although the pirated editions are often rather garbled, Shakespeare made no attempt to interfere. About 1612, when he was 48 years old, he suddenly retired from writing, returned to Stratford, and resumed living with his wife. He died there in April 1616 and was buried in the church courtyard. The stone over his supposed grave does not bear his name. However, some time later a monument was erected on the wall nearby. 3 weeks before his death, he executed a will, leaving most of his property to his elder daughter, Susanna. She and her descendants continued to live at Newt Palace until the last of them died in 1670. It should be pointed out that a good deal of the foregoing biography is pure conjecture on the part of orthodox biographers. For example, there is no actual record of Shakespeare ever being a student at Stratford Grammar School, nor did any student or teacher there ever claim to have been a classmate or instructor of the famous playwright. Similarly, it is unclear that he ever had an acting career. Nevertheless, at first sight, the official story may sound plausible. However, as soon as we examine it closely, grave difficulties arise. The first problem, mentioned even by many orthodox biographers, is that we have so little information about the life of Shakespeare, very much less than we would expect to have about prominent a person. In an attempt to explain this surprising paucity of data, people sometimes say he lived almost 400 years ago. Naturally, most of the documents by and about him have been lost. But that view greatly underestimates the amount of information we have about the era Shakespeare lived in. He was not living in a backward country or a barbaric age, but in England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, a well documented era where there were printing presses, where writing materials were commonplace, and where very many persons knew how to read and write. Of course, many papers have been lost, but several million original documents from that era still survive. Because of the great interest in William Shakespeare, an army of scholars has spent 3 generations scouring that data, searching for information about the world's most renowned literary genius. As a byproduct of that search, they have uncovered reams of information about every other major poet of the day and about many minor poets as well. But all they have uncovered about Shakespeare are about 3 dozen minor references, not one of which describes him as a poet or a playwright. We know incomparably more about the lives of Francis Bacon, Queen Elizabeth, Ben Jonson, or Edmund Spenser than we do about Shakespeare's life. Indeed, we know far more about even such a minor poet as John Lilly than we do of Shakespeare. The contrast with Isaac Newton, history's foremost scientific genius, is particularly striking. We have many thousands of original documents by and about Newton, who, like Shakespeare, came from a small town in England. Admittedly, Newton was born 78 years after Shakespeare, but we also have much more detailed information about Galileo, born the same year as Shakespeare, about Michelangelo, born 89 years earlier, or even about Boccaccio, born in 1313, than we do about Shakespeare.